Today is Tuesday, December 1st, 2015. My name is Ann Peskin. It is my honor and privilege today to interview State Representative Don Scherer. Good morning, Don.
Good morning, Ann. Good to see you.
Would you please tell me your name?
I'm Don Scherer, known around Stanford as Donny. And that's,
Where were you born?
I was born in Stanford.
And so, can I ask how old you are?
I'm 68.
Now tell us a little bit about your parents and where they came from, and then of course your grandparents.
Sure. Well, my father was at Sabra. He was born in Tel Aviv when it was Palestine. His family all came from the famous town of Chelm, and contrary to some of the myths about Chelm, my grandparents and great-grandparents, the men were very learned, and my grandfather was one of 8 siblings, and every one of them eventually, by the early 1920s, settled in Palestine. My father and his mother followed my grandfather to America when my father was about 8, and settled in Lower East Side, New York, in Orchard Street. Had a classic Orchard Street, Lower East Side upbringing. And my father graduated Seward Park High School with Tony Curtis, and then was drafted into the Army. But at the time, they had that educational program where the soldiers went to NYU. He was in a group like where Henry Kissinger was in, where they marched every day to class. Then it got really rough in Europe, and they sent my father to training, and he eventually was in the Battle of the Bulge and received the Bronze Star and a number of other commendations, Purple Heart as well. My mother grew up in, was born in the Bronx, but came to Stanford around 1935 with her parents. Her parents both came from Eastern Europe as well. And my grandmother was a cook. We didn't call them chefs in those days, but she was a fabulous Jewish cook. Opened a restaurant on Pacific Street for a period of time, next to all the famous Jewish Stanford landmarks, Sandhouse, Sachs, Weinstein's, Brazel's, all of them. She was right next to the Atlantic Fish Market. And then she closed it and went strictly into catering. And by the time the 1960s, early 60s came around, when she retired, she was one of the largest kosher caterers in Stanford, Danbury, Fairfield County, and a bit of like Port Chester. Her biggest competition was a woman like my grandmother named Ma Falk. And you either, if you were bar mitzvahed or married, you either went to Mrs. Falk or Mrs. Prushansky. That was the deal.
Did the restaurant have a name?
I don't know the name. I don't know the name.
And her name?
Was Rose Prushansky. And her husband did the heavy lifting, but my grandmother was the cook, and she was fabulous. And they had a home on Suburban Avenue, which is where Avalon is now. And that home had a number, it was an old, 3-story house. I don't know when it was built, in the 1800s. And she turned it into a rooming house of men, and all bachelors. Eventually, a couple came in who were refugees from the Holocaust, and then later converted to different clientele. But she used to have about 8 men. They started out mostly Jewish, who lived in that house, and they would come downstairs and watch TV with my grandparents, and she would serve like cookies and snacks, and it was a well-known thing. And what I found out also is that after the Holocaust, and the refugees that did come to Stanford, which were a large group, did not have kosher facilities. They had apartments with hardly any, stoves, and they didn't have microwaves. My grandmother opened up her kitchen to any kosher refugees. And I also found out that Henry Lieberman, Joe's father, when he first came to Stanford, lived in a one-room place, and he didn't have a kitchen, and my grandmother fed him as well. So she had a great history of helping people, and that could have been where it all started. My mother graduated Stanford High, and then my dad met her in the Catskills, and then he settled in Stanford after the war. And they were married young. My mother was 17, and my father was 19. And he was just ready to go off to Europe, and they got married on a furlough at the Jewish Center. So that's my family background.
You were born in Stanford?
I was born in Stanford, yeah.
Went through the school system?
Well, I started in Stanford schools, but my grandfather, my father's father, had moved out to California in the 1940s. And after the war and after my father graduated college, he really wanted to be with his father. And he moved the whole family, my sister was little, me, I was 5, out to San Fernando Valley, LA. And we lived there for about 4 years until my mother's homesickness took over, and she eventually prevailed to come back to Stanford. Then I went through the Stanford schools, graduated Ripon, and then went to UConn.
Talking about the family, what did you do at the dinner table? Did you have any kind of political conversations?
Well, political conversations were scattered with community service. There was a combination. My mother was very active in Hadassah. She was chapter president in Stanford and was a founder of the Gladys Sales Group, which kind of merged with all the chapters later on. She was very committed to that, and all of her friends that grew up with her from Stanford and stayed in Stanford were with her, so they were together all the time. And they were also involved in the couples club at the synagogue of Good Shalom. And so they were always doing things and always putting on fundraisers and having dinners and stuff like that. But then my father got involved in the Board of Representatives in the late 60s, early 70s. So I was in high school and college, but I would come home or be home and hear him talk about constituent service and doing things or having little disputes with the mayor and stuff like that. So I was aware at the dinner table of things going on in the community through my father, who then went on to become a state representative after that.
Did you do anything in college? Were you active in any?
Yes. First of all, I was very active in high school in Stanford, in the student council, and I was in Boy Scouts right until I went off to college. So I went through all the ranks there. Shy of Eagle had all the prerequisites for Eagle. I just didn't. I left before I could get it. And then at the time, I was one of the Boys of the Year in Connecticut for the work I did in community service. When I went to UConn, I got involved in the Campus Community Fund, which was from the Greek side, because I was in a Jewish fraternity, Phi Sigma Delta, which is now ZBT. And I was active as their chairman and liaison to the Greek side of the community festival. But President Babbage at the time, Homer Babbage, there was a big push to have off-campus living. UConn was an absolute on-campus school, or there were some commuters, but there was no off-campus living. And President Babbage formed the committee, and I was chairman of that. And eventually, by the time I was a senior, was in the first group of people to live in off-campus living. So I succeeded early on, formulating a policy and lobbying it and getting it done. So that worked out pretty well in college. And then after that, I went to law school, but in between I was in the service.
And who were your political, heroes growing up? Did you have any?
Well, I kind of was very impressed with Kennedy. It was just my age at that time. I was in high school when he was assassinated, but I thought his legacy was great. Thereafter, the presidents, while I was in high school and college, were all dealing with the Vietnam situation, and there was just such turmoil around politics at that time that I found it difficult to latch on to anyone. Ribbentrop, it was funny, I had a little connection with Ribbentrop through Joe Lieberman. He was working for Ribbentrop. I had gotten a nomination to the Air Force Academy through Ribbentrop. I didn't get an appointment, but I got as far as the nomination. And I always tell my wife if I'd gone there, I never would have met her because she went to UConn, so that worked out. That worked out great. And so it was really tough, by the time, then it was my father who was like, I was so involved in local politics. My father, considered a liberal, was brought into local politics through Stewie Conspore, who owned Conspore's men's store. And Stu was a Republican, and he was active with the powers that be. It was very factionalized. There were two big factions, and Stu was part of one. Brought my father in. So I got really to know the local politicians more than the state. I was not involved in that. In the federal, it was hard, but I was able to have it close at hand. I saw what my father did and how he traveled to Hartford and what he did for people. Constituent service was important to him, and it became one of the hallmarks of my terms up in Hartford was constituent service.
Question, did he work while he was
My
there?
dad was a school teacher.
That's what I thought.
And he was a guidance counselor at Ripon High School for years.
And
When
he
it
was
opened up until, well, the school system was very good to, if you wanted to be a state legislator, they'd let you leave early during the session. He used to travel Hartford with Tony Truglia, who was the state's rep with him, and they carpooled together. Otha Brown was from Norwalk, but he was a guidance counselor at Ripon. So the three of them would go up to Hartford together, or or one or two of them together. And they were fair to the teachers. They didn't dock them or anything. At one point, my father was the work-study counselor, which gave him a little more freedom. So they were, and Tony Truglia did something else. So they allowed them the flexibility. But my dad taught right until he retired as a guidance counselor.
Now, how would you define politics?
Well, I agree with Tip O'Neill that all politics is local. But it's very fickle as well. You can be the best at what you do and be loved by many, but if the tide is against you, it could destroy your future in politics. And it happened to my father, and it happened to me at the same time, at different times, but the same way. My father was popular and successful as a state rep, and yet the Nixon bundle of joy that took place got my father out of office. And then I had the anti-Bush sentiment, and there was a sweep of Republicans that year, and I was part of the sweep. And so politics, it is local, and people still remember the good, and they respond to it, which is really nice. And I've been out of politics for 9 years or so, and yet I still hear people say there's our representative or something. So, it does give you good feeling for getting things done. And when I go up to Hartford and meet the lobbyists, your reputation follows you, and they come out of the woodwork when they see me walking through the halls, because we always had a good rapport. So, politics is local, and it's an interesting phenomenon.
Talking about being local, you had to run for it. Was it difficult to get the appointment to run, or how did it work for you?
It wasn't, I had a probably an easy transition, because I was on the Board of Representatives in Stanford for 16 years, and I was the minority leader. And when the seat opened up, the president of the board, who was a Democrat, and I, who was the minority leader, challenged each other. So it was a real fight of kind of two leaders or powerful individuals in local politics. And the good news was that the district was Republican for years because it was supported by New Canaan, part of New Canaan. And so even if you were a powerful Democrat, you still had to fight the numbers in New Canaan that kind of tilted the scale a little. And and I was part of that process. So getting a nomination when the at the time current state representative announced he was running for state senator, the Republicans came to me as the natural choice. So I didn't have to fight for it. It was whether or not I wanted to do it, and after talking to my family, it was, let's do it, you know. And it was very interesting how I got into it. I never wanted to be a state rep when I was in local politics. But I was involved in changing a big adoption law as a civilian. And I spent a lot of time in Hartford working with, as the advisor to, the, I forgot what it was called, the Legislative Review Commission. And when I came home, I said to my wife, I said, you know, I could do this. I said, I like to be able to get things done and work with these people, and people knew me from other places, whether it was lawyers knew me from court or whatever, and I said, you know, I could do this. So I did eventually, and that's how I really made that decision.
Was it expensive campaigning, and was it difficult?
Yeah. When I ran, we didn't have the Citizens Election Fund, which now is easy, in my opinion. I had to raise about, for my first two campaigns, around $35,000 to $40,000 for each campaign.
What year was that?
2002 and then 2004. In 2006, you know, and I raised it. I was able to do it. It was, you know, in the beginning, it was all local people. The second election, the lobbyists contributed a substantial amount because you were proven, and if they liked you, they supported you. And that gave me I probably got out of 40,000, at least half or a little less from the lobbyists. So I didn't have to push as much locally, and people get tired of giving. You know, you go to the well all the time. The third time was a real trip because my opponent was a first-time candidate, but he was extremely connected through his college and law school experience, and he had contributions. First of all, he took it on as a full-time endeavor. I was supporting a family working in my law practice and a state representative and running. This guy took time, 6 months off from work just to do this. He collected about over $80,000 worldwide. I collected $80,000 just in Connecticut and Stanford, whatever, and it was a huge amount of money for a state rep seat, huge. Probably one of the highest at the time. But it didn't go unnoticed because of the numbers that were going into the, you know, when we reported. But it wasn't difficult in the sense, but what happened was my leadership came to me and they saw his numbers and they said, you gotta raise more money, you know, and it wasn't something I really wanted to do, but I had to get out. So I did every kind of, you know, I did television ads and mailings that never were done before for a state rep seat, and you know, it was still a problem.
What did you do for campaigning before this section?
Well, I always went door to door.
Okay.
And I always tried to target areas that had a reputation of coming out to vote. And what I tried to do is, you know, and I had signs and I had mailings and did all that stuff. And, you know, and running at the state level is so much different than the local level. At the local level, you have signs and you do one mailing or two. But at the state level, you really have to pump it out almost every 2 weeks, and then at the end, twice a week. And that's where the money goes. And then you have the radio ads, and then you have the TV stuff. So you pay for that, you know, with Cablevision and all that. It was, you know, it gets professional because you have to hire a professional person to organize your media. So it's a different level. And I did everything that people expect to be done at that level. And it was an experience. It was interesting. It was fun, but it's a lot of work. You have to have every week a committee meeting, and you have your treasurer constantly, you know, communicating with you, and it's a whole different, you know. And then you have your people in Hartford, because although when they're working they can't help you, the caucus people do dual duty. So the caucus people at night and on weekends work for candidates. So I was assigned one of the political strategists from the caucus, and they work with me. So we get the caucus message out and support from the caucus, and the minority leader is able to funnel money to me through his PAC. You know, there was stuff like that. So it was a whole different level than from local.
Now I know you're Republican.
Mm-hmm.
Are you Republican because your father was Republican?
Absolutely, absolutely. In order for me, in those days, as I said before, there were some factional Republican issues, and there are two big factions, and he was in one of them eventually, and they primaried every election, every seat, the two factions in those days. And in order for me to vote for my father in the primary, I had to be a registered Republican. During the election, it wouldn't have made any difference. So I started out that way, and then what happened is I got elected the same summer. I ran the same summer I graduated law school. As soon as I passed, I took the bar in July. I assumed I passed because I felt comfortable. I got nominated in that district in Springdale, and part of North Stanford, against two incumbents, to challenge two incumbents. And my wife would never let me do politics until I graduated and took the bar. That was our rule in the house, and because she knew how, you know, much time it takes, and if you're committed. So I did run that first time, and I beat both incumbents. I was 27, I think, at the time. And then I just kept winning elections, and then I was in leadership, and it was very interesting. I really was all childhood friends with Joe Lieberman. And when he was making some big decisions, I actually approached him and said, Joe, how can I help you, and what can I do? And we had these discussions, and one of the things he said is that you're extremely vested in your party, and to switch, you'd have to start from scratch in any other party, a Democratic Party or whatever. And and he counseled me to stay where I was and help him as nicely and quietly as I could, if that's what I wanted to do. So once I was there, I stayed there, and that's the way it is.
And your wife supported you through all this?
Through all this,
That's a
yeah.
lot of time.
She was very supportive. She's not as, it's hard to explain the way we operate as a political couple. The deal was, if I felt she had to be someplace, she was there with bells on, and she would work the room. A perfect example was the Sawmill Neighborhood Association always had a before Christmas brunch at the Long Ridge Tavern. Well, they were a nice big block of votes, and they were homeowners and good folks, and very supportive of me as a group. But they invited my wife and I to the brunch, and she would come, and we'd walk in, and I'd go left, and she'd go right, and we would both, meet when it was kind of time to eat. But other times, I would say, I have to go here. She said, do I have to go? I said, no, you don't have to go. And she wouldn't go. It was not something she really enjoyed. She was there at every election. She worked every election. She was literally chairman of the group that ran the numbers and the calling. She organized the calling out of voters, and she knew who voted and who didn't vote. You know, so she was like a pro because we did that for my father. And we learned in the old way too, when they were using slide rules to calculate percentages of voters coming out, and we would put the voter list on the walls of our dining room and mark in red or blue, and it was all done old-fashioned. And my wife and I learned that way, and when we started running for me, that's how we did it locally, and then even at the state level, a little more sophisticated, because then things were entered into the computer, and the computer spit out results. So, you know, but we knew how to do it, and it was a family thing.
You were a rep for the city.
I was a rep for 16 years, yeah. And that's where I got my legs with constituent service, and leadership too. But I was on very key committees, legislative and rules. I was on the fiscal committee, so you know I knew all about the budget and everything about it. So I was on the steering committee. You know, there was in those days leadership had a big role in the agenda, and we would meet with the mayors and you know try to get things done. It was a great experience locally. It was a great experience. A little different at the state level, but you can, if you do the constituent service right, you can really get some results.
Can you tell a story about one of your special memories, something that really stands out?
And where?
Either place.
Well, I think one of the, you know, generally, in Stanford things were pretty smooth. We didn't have big battles. It was, you know, very collegial. Up in Hartford, I remember one of the first budgets I worked on, I was approached by the black and Latino caucus leaders with the caucus behind them. And they all came over to me, and I said, "What's up?" And they said, "We need your help." And here I was, a first-term Republican, and the chairman of the Appropriations Committee was a Democrat and black. And I said, "How can I help you?" And they said, "Well, we just have a feeling that we're not going to get certain things in the budget for our cities, for our communities," they say, that we needed. And we were wondering if you could speak to the leadership of appropriations and get these things in the budget. I thought that was very, very interesting, because I was not part of the black or Latino caucus, and neither was I a Democrat, and neither did I have, I thought, influence. But I went up to the chairman and prevailed upon him to put all these items back in the budget that were cut out. So that was really a big victory, and it boded well for later on, because whenever I needed anything to get done, I would go to the leadership of those caucuses and say, "I need your help getting me some votes," and they would work for me on things that I sponsored or co-sponsored. So that was really a nice thing. And then after I got out, it was very interesting. I was recognized in the field of adoption and assisted reproductive technology law, which was a new field, surrogacy and everything else. And it really, that part came into being and a bigger deal than just the science of it. See, the doctors were doing their work, and then the lawyers had to do their work, and and then you had to go through the system and the court system to make sure things would work out. But in 2003, 4, in that area, Connecticut was one of the first states that did civil unions, and we recognized same-sex relationships in many, many aspects of life. And I was one of the co-sponsors of those laws and the civil union bill, and I was a Republican. I had license in the Republican caucus to be liberal. It was there was a guy that was there for years before I got there who was Mr. Liberal, and he actually died during my first term. And I kind of took over from his legacy, and his son actually took his seat. So his son, was a Democrat, but this guy was a Republican from New Britain. And I did a lot of more liberal things than our caucus generally did. And I was one of the movers from our side on the civil union stuff. And then what happened was the family development was an integral part of that. And so I got involved in that as a continuum to that.
Did you have any obstacles, and how did you overcome them if you had them?
The biggest obstacle, believe it or not, was trying to keep my practice afloat and get to Hartford 75 days a year for a part-time job. And you're at the beck and call of your caucus leadership. So my aide would call me either at the end of the day or early in the morning and say, I just want to tell you that today you have to be in New Britain at 5 o'clock, or you have to do this, or someone died and we're going to a wake, or they're calling a caucus to discuss the budget, even though they weren't doing it for a week or two. And they even had retreats on weekends where we had to go to a hotel in upstate, in Connecticut, somewhere, Waterford, and stay over and spend 8 hours a day in the process. And so the obstacle was getting up, going to my office, working and getting things done, going up to Hartford, coming back at the end of the day, going to my office and working until my work was done, checking my mail, doing stuff, and still doing the Hartford stuff. And then when we were in session, I figured out a plan where I came to the conclusion that if they called the session at 10 o'clock, it wouldn't start till 1. I figured it out. I became a genius. So what I would do is go at 1, or I'd go at maybe 12:30, because our caucus, since we were in the minority, had very little to say. I mean, you could discuss things, but so what? We were so outnumbered by the Democrats that I would just say, you know what, the caucus, I'll get there. But this way I stayed in my office and I made appointments and I did things. So that was the obstacle. Legislation, if you're on a good bill, it's going to pass.
Did you have any problem because of anti-Semitism?
Never.
Never affected any aspect?
No, it really didn't. Not that. It's funny, I think my dad may have had a couple issues when he was a city rep, but I never did. I never had a problem. I was always, very close to the minority communities in Stanford, and that, from high school I was close, and then all through politics I was close. And not that it would have come from there all the time, but all the Italian communities, I grew up with these kids, and so I was a known commodity, and I was fair to everybody, and I never had that issue.
We talked about you. You have children?
2 kids. Grown kids.
What?
Grown
by now.
Yeah.
And grandchildren?
Yes, I do. I do have a boy and a girl, a son and a daughter, and then 3 grandsons.
Now, are any of them in politics? Any?
No, none of them are in politics. None of them do neither of my grown kids do community service. My daughter is a life member of Hadassah, but it doesn't really do anything there. And she'll do her town in Massachusetts has a lot of community stuff. And she gets involved in working within the community to do events and work to network. But she has not done anything. When you have 3 little kids under 10, it's very difficult.
So your son doesn't have any children?
Not yet. Just got married last year.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Now, you talked about an area that you were very much involved in. Were there any other, want to talk a little bit more about that, or are there any other areas that you were involved in at the state level? Any kind of bills that you felt were important?
Well, I was never one of the problems I had, because I was a sole practitioner, is the committee process in Hartford. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday are considered A committees, which are the big boys: judiciary, appropriates, and taxation. The Tuesday, Thursday committees are less, they're important, but not like the big ones. I made it clear to my caucus leadership that I could only do Tuesday, Thursday. Had I won my third term, I would have had to move on because to bigger and better things, because it was just expected, and I would want to have made a bigger impact. So I was on committees like liquor control. Well, they didn't call it liquor control, it was general law. I became, early on, because of that committee, the consumer guru. I passed laws that helped consumers, and one of the important ones I did, that I created and actually got through, was when people had service contracts for their pool, their heating, anything for their home. In those days, they would have automatic, what was the word? You know, they would be renewed, automatic renewals. Mm-hmm. So what I did is I made that illegal. You cannot have automatic renewal. First of all, the renewal clause had to be in bold, larger print in the contract. And the people had to give you notice at least 60 days to 30 days before the renewal would go into effect to allow you to cancel. And that was a big bill that I did early on, and I got that through. I also was involved in labeling for health as part of the consumer stuff. And those were big bills, but then shortly thereafter, when the civil union issue came up, and the adoption stuff had to be cleaned up, I really started getting involved in all those things, and took a big role in that. And then eventually, when the reproductive technology law laws had to be made because doctors were making progress. I mean, in the mid-70s, they would do surrogacy, and you were lucky, even if you did what they would have called in vitro fertilization, the original test tube stuff, it was 5%, and then it maybe hit 10%. Now it's at 55 to 60% success rate. So the science had really started to move over the years, and the law had to catch up. So first, a small group of lawyers got nationwide. I was, I think, the first lawyer in the country to be involved in surrogacy in the mid-'80s. And then it grew nationwide, and then states started passing laws because issues came up. Connecticut had a major case that I was involved in, and went to the state Supreme Court. A surrogate didn't want to give up her rights, so they had to deal with the contract aspect of surrogacy. And traditional surrogacy, because of things like that, is now very little. It's now gestational carriers, which are independent carriers who have no genetic linkage to the child being carried. That is cleaner and healthier and more secure for the intended parents, but that is the way things move. So the laws had to be changed. We had a sperm donation law in the books for 30 years, but they never knew about egg donation because no one donated eggs. They couldn't do anything with it. But when the science figured out how to fertilize an egg independently of a woman's body, someone had to write a law for that, and I did. So, those were the kind of things that I got involved in, and the major things I did.
And probably those that have made you the proudest, if I were going to limit it.
Well, family development's a very important thing. I have 2 adopted kids, so I wouldn't be in my position today with my family if I didn't adopt. And that's why I got into it originally as a young lawyer. But of all the things I do in my practice, that brings the most joy to me. And when I go into court and meet with judges, it brings the most joy to them as well. And a few years ago, I was recognized by Congress, U.S. Congress, as an angel in adoption, and I was brought down to Washington and received a congressional award, so to speak, as an angel in adoption, which is really a very, a fine award to have. And it's the kind of thing where this kind of work I've done, some of which is outside of politics, it's just to do the right thing and get people in a better place, will be carried on long after I'm either not practicing law or not around, which is really a rewarding thing. And that's the best I can say about it.
Now that we've talked about the good, what was one of the most regrettable moments that you've had?
Well, it was good. It was bad and good. Losing that election was a bad thing, but it turns out that it was a good thing. But one of the things that was a difficult decision I made, and it hurt me later on, is sometime around 2005 there was an anti-violence bill and was an anti-gun bill, and for the first time, Connecticut created a bill and wanted to pass a law to tighten up gun laws. And what they did, it's when they write laws in Hartford, sometimes it goes through 2 or 3 incarnations before it finally becomes a law. And at each juncture, it gets tweaked to a point where it's better than the previous version, but may not be good enough. I can never separate myself from being a lawyer and being a state representative. So I have a very general practice, so I have a lot of experience in a lot of different things, which I brought with me to Hartford. I bring with me to a party on a Saturday night, because it's just, if I see a slippery step, I tell the homeowner. It's just the way I am. And most lawyers would be that way. And I had practiced criminal law throughout my career. And I had practiced, civil law and negligence and other things. The way they wrote that law, it criminalized perhaps a mistake. If you were on vacation, for example, and someone stole your gun, but you didn't know it, and then later it was found out that gun was used in a crime and it was your gun and you didn't report it, you would be held to a felony count warrant. And I felt that that was too severe to an otherwise upstanding civilian who may have had a gun for their own reasons. It could have been licensed or anything. They could have had it hidden or locked away. And someone knew how to get to it or got to it, and they didn't know it because they didn't really use their gun. And I thought about it for a long time, but the lawyer in me wouldn't allow a whole new level of criminality to take place because of this bill. I also, believe in some of the Second Amendment rights and the gun rights, and people have a right to do certain things. And I never was a big fan of big government. That's the Republican side of me, although socially and fiscally I'm a social, fiscal Democrat Republican. But I don't like big government and that kind of thing. So I voted against that. And I don't regret voting against it, but I regret the effect that vote had on my political future, because that was one of the things that was brought up in the election I lost. In fact, that was tweaked the next term to exactly the way I wanted it and the way I spoke about it, except it never got amended that way. And excuse me. So that was probably a big one.
Now, we've talked about a lot of things. What would you say your legacy?
I think my biggest legacy will be in family development and the adoption and the reproductive technology laws that are taking place. People are having families now that could not have children. There's part of it is the social aspect of couples getting married in their late 30s. career couples getting married in their 30s or late 30s, and then, trying to have a career before they have a family, and then unable to have children. This allows, and it's interesting with adoption, if you go, Connecticut's an agency-only state. For the most part, if you go to an agency and you want to adopt, there's an age cutoff, and there always was. It was 40, maybe 42 at some places. One or two places may do 46, 45. But what if you're 47 and you want to have a child? You couldn't adopt. Now there's no age cutoff on if you want to do fertility treatments and you and your husband want to have a child. Not everyone gets a carrier. Some people just can't get pregnant within their body, but they can get fertilized, embryos that are then transferred into the wife, and she gives birth naturally. So there's all different aspects of the field that I've been involved in, and that's going to be there forever, probably.
Now, is there anything else you want to, that I haven't gotten to ask you about that you want to share?
Well, it's funny, when you get involved in politics, it's really community service. I was on the board of the Synagogue of Good Shalom, and I've been on, different boards for different groups. When I was a city representative and before I was a state representative, I had a boating background because I was in the Coast Guard. And people knew that I was in the Coast Guard and I was a boater. And the governor, Rowland, appointed me harbor master of Stamford. And I was harbor master of all the water, state water in Stamford for 6 years. And I took that job very seriously to make sure that, the primary function was to represent the state and to ensure that there was proper navigation of public waters. But I made sure it was safe for people to boat. I made sure that the industries down at the south end that were using barges were safe. I made sure that if there was stuff in the water that they were responsible for cleanup. I had to deal with the overturned barges down by the break wall when they flipped over with tons and tons of bluestone rock. We had to get that cleaned up, and I was able to use my power of enforcement. I worked with the Stanford Police, so the Marine Division. So that was a very interesting part
When
of
was
my.
that?
That was probably, let me see, 1996 to 2002. Because it was appointed by the governor and it was considered an executive appointment, when I became a state rep, which was legislative, it was an implied conflict of interest, or an apparent conflict of interest. So I had to quit that. But that was something that was done. And people, I'll do, like right now, the city of Stamford the mayor's office asked me to be the civil hearing officer for the city. So
What?
Civil hearing officer. So when people violate ordinances and they get fined and have to pay a fine and they want to take an appeal, I hear the appeal. The other thing I've done is, as part of my practicing law, I've been doing it over 40 years, and I feel that as a senior lawyer, unfortunately it's my title now, I have to give back, which is just the way I'm built. It's in my DNA to give back. So I sit once a month on the bench as an attorney trial referee. I was appointed by the Chief Justice in Connecticut. And I actually have I'm considered a non-judicial officer, but I have binding judicial powers in civil cases, non-jury and not family. So I can hear multi-million-dollar contract cases and negligence cases and everything. And I actually do that and render decisions. And I do that for the good of the court. And I attend to their docket once a month and do mediations and arbitrations. And I knock off sometimes 10 cases on a Friday. So that's giving back, to the I wouldn't, if I didn't have the court system, I wouldn't have been able to do my job and help people. So I've given back there too. So I don't stop really. I just, I do that and I sing. I'm in the Stanford Chorale. That's been my thing since high school, a singer, so I do that.
Well, it's been delightful sharing all the things you've done, and thank you so much.
It's my pleasure to be here. I'm glad you're doing this project.